Good evening. The Hebrew calendar's fast day of the 9th of Av falls this year on the 11th of August. On this day, Jews mourn the destruction of the first temple built by King Solomon and the second temple built by Herod. Both these temples stood in Jerusalem. Both were destroyed on exactly the same day of the Hebrew calendar. The first was destroyed on the 9th of Av, 586 BCE, and the second on the 9th of Av in the year 70 CE. Someone once wrote that to be a Jew is to be a prisoner of memory. The 9th day of Av has left indelible scars on the Jewish psyche. And like so much of the Jewish drama across the ages, we embrace this day as though it had occurred to us personally. The 9th day of Av is Judaism's Pearl Harbor. The day is known as Tisha BeAv. Tisha is 9 in Hebrew, so Tisha BeAv simply means the 9th day of the month of Av. The fast commences at sunset on the 8th of Av and stretches until the sunset on the 9th of Av. During the fast, we sit on the floor as ordained by Jewish mourning traditions. We minimize chatter and joviality on that day, and we abstain from food and drink. In synagogues, we chant dirges with funeral melodies, and during the synagogue service, we read Jeremiah's evocative book of Lamentations, which narrates the destruction of the first temple and the Babylonian exile of 70 years. Although this day is set aside primarily to mourn the destruction of both temples, many other tragedies have befallen Jewish communities on this same day. Notably, in 1242, the Crusaders burnt Jewish holy books in Paris. In 1290, the Jews of England were expelled from that country. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the mass deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. The 9th day of Av is the saddest day of the Jewish calendar, and we especially cling to the memory of Jerusalem as the center of our spiritual source. I have argued that Jews have no history. We have memory. Memory is much more powerful than history. When Jews were led into captivity to Babylon after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, they sat down and wept by the rivers of Babylon and remembered Zion. Then Jews swore never to forget Jerusalem. When we pray towards Jerusalem. At the end of wedding ceremonies, the groom breaks a glass testifying to the Jewish people's continued mourning over the temple's destruction on this day. 3 weeks of incremental mourning paved the way to Tisha BeAv. 21 days before the destruction of the second temple, Jerusalem itself fell. Josephus, the contemporary historian, estimated that in those 21 days, about 1 million Jews were slaughtered by the Romans during the Roman occupation of the land of Israel. The Romans renamed Israel Palestine after the long extinct Philistine of the biblical era. In 135 CE, the Romans renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina after their emperor Aelius Hadrianus and their god Jupiter Capitolinus. All that remains of this second temple is the western wall. All other traces of the temple were razed to the ground by conquering forces. The interpretations of rabbis of the Song of Songs and the Book of Lamentations written over 1,600 years ago, promise explicitly that the western supporting wall of the temple will never be destroyed. Jerusalem and the temples were completely destroyed together with the walls during the 18 sieges to which the city was subjected, and yet the western wall remained and remains standing. Tisha BeAv teaches us to harness visionary power and spiritual strength to transform something negative into good. The Western Wall, formerly known as the Wailing Wall, was bathed in the tears of Jews who came to fondle its stones, immersed in a sense of paralyzing impotence. Visits to the wall were always dependent on the magnanimity or charity of some occupying power. In June 1967, when Israeli paratroopers captured eastern Jerusalem from Jordanian forces, soldiers, politicians, and civilians alike from the Jewish world rushed to visit the wall. The story is told of a visit by Napoleon to Paris. He heard the sound of wailing coming from inside a building and asked one of his generals to inquire what was going on inside the building. Napoleon was advised the Jews are mourning the loss of their temples. But what temples? Napoleon asked. I've not heard of the destruction of any temple. The Jews are mourning, he was told, the destruction of their temples in Jerusalem, the last of which was destroyed 2,000 years ago. The emperor replied, if they're still mourning the destruction of a temple razed to the ground so many years ago, they will still merit seeing it rebuilt. In 1967, the Western Wall came back to us after a 2,000 years exile. On Tisha BeAv, we have much to mourn for. Yet, as a line from one of my favorite films, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, inspires us, from the ashes of disaster grow the roses of success. Rabbis have taught us that the Messiah will be born on Tisha BeAv. Indeed, sunk in the trough of our greatest grief, we clutch at faith and fortitude. Messianism is a source of buoyancy for Jews, a potent force that has inspired and inspires us, guaranteeing Jewish continuity. On Tisha BeAv, we cry and mourn for so many things. The destruction of our temples is uppermost in our lament, but humanity's exile from self gives us inconsolable mourning too. We are comforted by the promise of salvation echoed by the prophets of Israel. Those who prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem equally foretold her rebirth. Of all the countless quotations, hymns and odes, "If I Forget Thee, O Jerusalem," most profoundly describes the bond between the Jewish people and Jerusalem. The late Eliyahu Tal, in his seminal book, Whose Jerusalem, wrote, "If memory is the true test of loyalty and love, the memory of Jerusalem, which spans over 3,000 years, represents an unbroken link between a people's devotion and a city that is unmatched in history." Tisha BeAv means digging into memory to strengthen us with fortitude, endurance, and enterprise. Indeed, from the ashes of disaster are growing the roses of prophetic vision. Shalom and thank you for listening.